Khalid, if you are there, could you please like turn your camera on so we kind of like know that you're there and ready? There he is. Give him a wave. Khalid, if you want to remember to record this, yeah,
Yes.
okay. I'm going to shut up now and I'm going to hand you over to Khalid.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Before I start, Mandy, I'd just like you to just tell us what led you to choose Pomegranate specifically as the title of the festival, because this has to do with the theme of synchronicity, which we got into yesterday.
Okay, yeah, sorry. What was that again?
So the question is like, why did you choose specifically pomegranate, like instead of strawberry, right?
Honestly, it just immediately, I just thought, oh, the strawberry fair, it's a fruit. And I thought, pomegranates, they're there in the tarot. So it was just an instant thing, to be quite honest. Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting because that strikes me as another example of synchronicity, which is a topic that Sharon covered yesterday, because instinctively it just came into your head, and then at a later stage you realized, oh, it is relevant to the tarot because it's there in the card of the High Priestess, right?
Yeah, and the High Priestess is related to the moon as well, which we didn't realize.
Right.
We didn't realize about the full moon at that moment.
It's like multiple sequences of synchronicity, which I think is amazing.
I know.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically that's the entryway. That's like the first level explanation of the connection between pomegranates and the festival and the High Priestess. Okay, so let's see what more we can get out of that. Okay, so the title of today's presentation is Persephone's Pearls, the Price and Promise of Dark Knowledge. And this title was inspired by this thematic connection between the High Priestess and Persephone, which has been developed over the years, and now it has a very strong, a strong kind of currency in the thoughts of everyone who's dealing with tarot and teaching about it.
Mic off. Okay. Mic on.
I'm hearing that same sound from your computer. Am I gone? Am I gone? It's very loud. I don't know if you can find a way to get rid of it, but that would be great if you can. Right. So basically, the idea of Persephone having pearls, right? That's about pearls, in the metaphoric sense of pearls of wisdom. Okay. So the wisdom that Persephone, a figure from Greek mythology, got after her descent into the underworld and her re-emergence from there. And also there's the pearl that is sitting on the crown of the High Priestess, right? And the High Priestess, as you might see if you look at the card. I don't know, Sharon, if you have the card up next to the PowerPoint presentation. Do you have that? Sharon?
Right there. Can you see it?
Okay, 1 second. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So I have to switch between the Zoom room and my own PowerPoint slide and my own image of the High Priestess. So I just wanted to make sure, right? If you could maybe like magnify that image. I don't know if that's possible. Right. Okay, perfect. So you see, those are clearly pomegranates around her, and they're shaped in the pattern of the Sephira, the kind of nodes of divine kind of manifestation in the Tree of Life, which is a concept that was developed in Kabbalah, a kind of a branch of Jewish mysticism. But we'll get into all of that later. But anyway, you can see that this big gigantic pearl on top of her head, and then these horns, which are often taken to represent the waxing and waning phases of the moon. And then you have the moon here as well, just kind of reinforcing the connection between the High Priestess, the moon, which we talked about yesterday, And it's a very relevant connection because both deal very intensely with the topic and the experience of intuition and discovering reality through intuition. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead with the presentation. All right. So I'm moving to the second slide. Okay. So what's the symbolism of pomegranates? So if you study the symbolism, you'll find out that they're quite prominent in many ancient cultures and religions, and these include ancient Greek, East Asian, Indian, Jewish, and Christian. Okay, and they include the following meanings: fertility and the ability to have many descendants. They also include the female genitals and sexuality. So, for example, in like many Vietnamese kind of artistic artifacts, you can find the pomegranate as a symbol of the female genitals, right? Then it also figures as an antidote, sorry, to barrenness in old kind of Indian folklore. So the idea is if you drink pomegranate juice, and you have issues with fertility as a woman who wants to conceive, and if you drink pomegranate juice, that raises your potential to have children. Okay, and then very interestingly, in spite of all the symbolism coming from pre-Christian, pagan, or cultures, or cultures from different the religions, even the early fathers of the church, who got to define what Orthodox Christianity is, the symbolism of the pomegranate appealed to them. Like they saw it as a kind of a self-contained kind of representation of a meaningful spiritual life. So the shell of the pomegranate and their symbolism represented the church, and the seeds represented the followers of the church, the pious Christians following the church, and contained kind of within its sphere of spiritual guidance and protection. Okay. And this is most relevant, I think, for the symbolism that's directly on the High Priestess card. So this symbolism comes from Jewish scripture and Jewish religious thought and commentary. Okay, so from this angle, pomegranates represent food, like one of 7 staple foods that were designated by God as being sacred and beneficial to the Jewish people. One of these 7 is the pomegranates, okay? And they were seen as kind of conferring a kind of a spiritual, a beneficial spiritual effect, okay? And if you look at the some of the books in the Old Testament, like for example, the Book of Kings, you will learn that King Solomon decorated the tops, called the capitals, like the tops of the pillars, with rows and 2 rows of pomegranates on each capital, and the pomegranates on each capital numbering to around something like 200. Okay, so it's a pretty intense focus on pomegranates there. In the High Priestess card, these pomegranates have been transferred from the capitals of the columns to the screen behind her. Okay, and also you can see on the capitals, like on the columns, on the black column you see the letter B, and on the white column you see the letter J. And very interestingly, the B is white and the J is dark, to suggest the kind of the dark that it's a kind of a yin yang kind of conceptual representation, right? That the light of yin exists in the darkness of yang, and the light the light of yang exists in the darkness of yin, and the darkness of yin exists in the light of yang, right? So the B and the J, they represent the words Boaz and Yakin, respectively. And these were supposed to have been, these words were supposed to have been carved on the columns on the instruction of Solomon. And there's no agreement on what they mean, really, but there's a common interpretation, which is that Boaz means in strength, or he acts in strength, or he exists in strength, and Yakin meaning in certainty. Okay, and I can sort of confirm that. Well, I can reinforce the likelihood of that interpretation because in Arabic, which is my native language, and a cousin to Hebrew, there is iz. Bi'iz means with the strength, and there's this word yaqeen, which means certain knowledge. Okay, so it's just interesting to keep those concepts in mind. Okay, all right, moving on. So we have Arthur Edward Waite, and we know this name. Maybe we don't know him in a biographical way, but we know him from the name of the most common version of the tarot, the most popular one. I would say around the world, but particularly in the Anglophone parts of the world. So Arthur Edward Waite was a member of an esoteric society called the Order of the Golden Dawn. He entered and left and entered and left several times, but eventually he fell out of, he had the big disagreements with other members, so he just left and did his own thing. But in 1909, he designed and got published the first version of what would later become known the Rider-Waite Tarot, which is what we deal with today. Okay, and he commented. He kind of delivered extended commentary on the cards of the tarot in this book called The Pictorial Key to the Tarot, which came out in 1910. And this is what he said about the High Priestess, okay? It, the High Priestess card, is sometimes held to represent the divine law and the gnosis, in which the priestess corresponds to the idea of the Shekinah. She is a secret tradition and the higher sense of the instituted mysteries. Okay, so this is a lot to unpack, but I'll try to do this in a brief way. So when he talks about divine law, I think he's doing that in a more specifically kind of a Jewish context, okay, Jewish mystical context, which is like the law of the one God, okay? And gnosis is a term that was popularized by, the followers of a syncretic kind of religion combining many different strands, but they were primarily identified as early Christians, and their philosophy was that, you know, the only way of really being religious was like to discover godliness and godhood within yourself through a process of remembrance, like remembering where you were before you got incarnated in the body, okay? And then there's Shekinah, which is a concept from Jewish mysticism and specifically Kabbalah, and it represents either the, you know, a manifestation of God's presence in the material world, something I guess you could say close to the idea of Holy Spirit, right, when it kind of descends, and also represents the more feminine aspects of the, you know, the divine reality, okay? So you can see from the wording here that the tradition of which the High Priestess, a symbol, is a part, is a secret tradition. And we can see that it's involved in a kind of, I don't want to use the word cult, but it's kind of like in the beliefs and the practices of a closed society, right? A higher sense of the instituted mysteries, right? So mystery rites and kind of rules and ceremonies that have been institutionalized over time, okay? And so here, like the receptive power of the high priestess, like her ability to access higher knowledge through the receptivity that is specific to her, is kind of exclusive. It's exclusively linked to the abilities and the knowledge of a closed, secretive circle of people, right? So there is this sense that what the high priestess can grant you is something that you can only reach if you're properly initiated to that level of knowledge and wisdom, okay? And I don't think this is like, you know, a kind of reductive or regressive approach to the high priestess in an absolute sense, but I do think it's limiting because it keeps her potential as a kind of symbolic guide pretty limited to a kind of a more select group of people, right? So once you place her at such a high pedestal, right? You can only access her by mounting to the pedestal where she's at. Then what she can give you becomes only available to a small select group of people, knowledgeable people. Okay. So although it might have its pros, approaching the high priestess as Shekinah, a concept inherited from the Jewish mystical tradition known as Kabbalah, risks restricting her knowledge, granting potential to a particular spiritual lineage, and setting her at a distance from the concerns of everyday human existence, which has developed countless cultural and spiritual traditions, not to mention complications and crises of an intensely ideological and political nature. And I think, especially because today we are being confronted very deeply with a crisis that is of an ideological and political, well, it has ideological and political implications, if not origins necessarily. It's really useful and important, I would say, for us to tap into the high priestess archetype to kind of to how it can empower us today, now, okay? Not in granting us access to some ethereal realm out there that is only kind of remotely connected to what's happening here, okay? All right, so moving on. So I'm calling this alternative approach to the high priestess archetype infernal/collective. And I don't mean directly by infernal like hellish, like taking you to hell, but more like taking you down, right, into the ugly experiences, the difficult experiences, the dark experiences that often have a hellish quality because of the intensity of their suffering, okay? And they're collective because they're just manifest on the material realm and they affect everyone who's a human being, right? Everyone who's limited, who is kind of limited to the limitations of the body and its vulnerabilities, right? And think here about our vulnerability to viral infection, right? To various types of diseases, right? That limits our possibilities as living creatures, at least in this lifetime, right? So an infernal perception of the high priestess, where she represents the will to dive into inner darkness and retrieve precious knowledge, allows her to speak or keep silent in ways that are more tangibly relevant to collective human experience and psychology. People are often trapped in opaque and oppressive psychic structures due to a combination of internal and external factors, okay? So all of us kind of grow up within family environments, social environments that develop in us different psychological challenges, complexes, maybe even neuroses. And all of us grow up kind of subject to we live our lives subject to real political and social constraints, right? So you're not completely free to wear what you want or talk in the way you want once you step outside your door, because you will be subject to scrutiny, right? And if you live, for example, in a very homophobic society, you're not completely free to go out with your partner, right? And be visibly, in a relationship with that partner, right? In the same sense, if you live in a very authoritative, dictatorial kind of country, you're not free to express your opinion about the structure of that political system unless you're willing to bear the very serious consequences. Right. So moving on to the following slide. So my initial my initial kind of prompt to connect the High Priestess to the myth, the Greek myth of Persephone, came from the book The Easiest Way to Learn the Tarot Ever by Dusty White. So according to Dusty White, the pomegranates in the card are key to understanding its esoteric meaning, particularly since they're connected to the myth of Persephone, who is the, quote, daughter of Demeter and Zeus, sometimes wife of Hades, and always queen of the dead. Okay? So there is this mythic connection between Persephone and the underworld, and all the human experiences that many religious traditions link to the underworld, right? Such as sin, suffering, being connected to kind of dark currents of energy, okay? That being connected, I would say being connected to the night itself, as possibly a more enduring reality than the visible world. And I'm thinking here of what the quantum physicists have been saying, that we only know 4% of the universe, and it seems like what we don't know is like 73% dark energy and then a large percentage of dark matter as well, right? So I feel like that once you connect the High Priestess to Persephone, you can see the kind of the combination as an ideal kind of mode of access to darkness as a foundation of reality. And I don't mean darkness here as evil, but I mean as like darkness as a kind of a wise form of non-action, right? A wise form of silence, right? Because action always has the risk of damage, right? I'm thinking of action, for example, think of Mars as the planetary archetype of action. I think there's a reason that Mars is considered to be a malefic in this sense, because its assertiveness carries with it the potential for damage to things in its surrounding, right? Whereas if you're passive and inert, you don't have that same risk, okay? But this is maybe diverging from the topic, okay? So let's move on to the following slide. Okay, so let's first summarize the myth of Persephone and then go on to questions that'll open up for us her relevance and the relevance of the connection between Persephone and the High Priestess. So basically the story of Persephone is she is the daughter of Zeus, who is the king among the Olympian gods who gain power after they overthrow the Titans, the earlier generation of gods. Zeus has as his consort his sister Demeter, who is the goddess of grains and agriculture. Okay, and his daughter from Demeter is Persephone. At that point in the myth, Zeus and his brother Poseidon, the god of the sea, are both married, but they have one brother who isn't, and this is Hades, to whom Zeus gave dominion over the underworld. Okay? And Hades comes up to Zeus asking for Persephone, who is also his niece, asking for her as his bride. And Zeus agrees. Zeus, Persephone's father, agrees. Okay, and they contrive an abduction plan. So one day, Persephone is out in a field gathering flowers with her friends, and Zeus kind of bursts out of the earth from the underworld below the earth, and with his golden chariot, and he abducts Persephone and he takes her down with him into the underworld, okay, to be his wife. Okay, so clearly she has no say in the matter. Okay, now once Demeter, her mother, discovers that Zeus planned all this, and now Persephone is the captive of Hades, in the dominion of Hades, she gets outraged, and she decides, as a kind of vengeance against Zeus and the other Olympian gods, to withdraw away from Mount Olympus, and thereby cause the earth to stop its production of crops. Okay, basically to risk, starving the entire human race. Okay, and thereby cause the gods to lose their chance to get sacrifices from people, like the sacrifices that the humans would present to the gods, as in the form of like fruits, for example. Okay, so to calm her down, Zeus appoints his son Hermes, he has the ability to travel easily between the human world, the world of the gods, and the underworld. He appoints Hermes as a messenger to go and talk Hades into releasing Persephone back to her world, the world of the gods, Mount Olympus. And Hades goes and has a talk with Persephone, and he manages to convince, he has a talk with Hades, and he manages to convince Hades to release Persephone so that she can go back to her home and restore the natural balance, right? The natural, succession of seasons, and restore agriculture and not endanger human life that way, or the dues of the gods. But Hades tricks Persephone into swallowing a pomegranate seed that is from his world, like his domain, which is called Erebus, which means also darkness. Okay, and because of that, like through this kind of magical contract, you could say, she becomes bound to spending a third of the year with Hades in the underworld, and then the other 2/3 with her parents and the other gods in Mount Olympus. Okay, so besides complaining about how she was treated, and and stating that she was forced to eat that pomegranate, right, seed, Persephone doesn't really have much voice in this narrative. The main actors are Zeus, Hades, and Demeter, but the person involved to whom all this is happening isn't given a voice, right, to express her feelings about what's happening to her. So this is important for us to consider in relation to the silent mode of the high priestess. Okay, so some key questions that emerge from this myth. first, where does the essence of life, represented by the juicy pomegranate, where does it lie between the outer world, the human world, and the nether world? Okay, so this question came to my mind because actually the position that Hades occupies, but Hades himself occupies between death and life is not that clear. One of the names that was given to Hades was Pluton, which in Greek means wealth, and that connection came from this association between between rich sources of life and wealth, like grains and minerals, being stored under the earth, and anything under the earth being the realm of Hades, right? So, the source of riches, the source of wealth, it's not clear where that source lies between the underworld and the visible world, okay? So yeah, where is that? Is it in Earth? Is it in Erebus, the realm ruled by Hades? Is life in the seed that comes out of the soil, or is it in the soil itself? Okay. And then related to this ambiguity, we have this related question of where is fertility and potent sexuality, the kind of sexuality that can produce the things that you need to actually live, right? Does it lie between God and goddess, Demeter and Hades? Does it lie between man and woman? Okay. So we have the opposition between Hades and Demeter, and also Hades and Persephone, because with Persephone's release from the underworld back to the human world, spring comes back again, and after it's summer, right? So agriculture gets restored, life gets restored, okay? But the pomegranate seed that's implicated in this whole scenario, really where the position occupies between life and death is very ambiguous, right? We've already seen that it represents sexuality and fertility and abundance in life in several traditions. But in that myth, it also comes from the realm of Hades. Okay, so there's that kind of liminal, this borderline position between life and death, this ambiguous space that is represented by the pomegranate. Okay. So, continue with the questions. How is Persephone's lack of voice in the myth relevant to the spiritual silence of the high priestess? Patriarchal social notions of female sexual passivity, think here of Persephone being powerless to resist abduction and rape, are linked to patriarchal religious archetypes like the spiritual virgin, Mary, mother of Jesus, the Christian nun, and the Vestal virgins of ancient Rome. Those followers of the goddess Vesta, who is the Roman counterpart of Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, who would dedicate 30 years of their lives just to the virginal worship of the goddess Vesta. Okay, so so basically, I'm thinking that we need obviously the gender politics behind this connection, right, between female sexual passivity and female spiritual receptivity. Okay. It's a kind of way of, I guess, grounding spiritual symbolism, spiritual gender roles in gender roles as kind of established by human hierarchies, right? Human relations. Okay. So seen, this is the following slide, seen as a mirror or extension of Persephone's voicelessness, where does the inward-looking silence of the high priestess lie between power and paralysis? Okay, so I think this kind of silenceness, this voicelessness is really in an ambiguous position between power and paralysis. the vulnerability of Persephone to abduction and rape is also linked to the status that she gains after she becomes queen of the underworld. You know, she's considered to have this formidable influence over all the souls that go into the underworld, and she becomes, you know, a goddess to be feared and respected. On the other hand, the power that she gains from a pretty violent encounter with a more powerful male god. Okay. So then this leads us to the question of, you know, what is the power of the silent receptivity of the high priestess? Okay. And we can phrase this ambiguous, mysterious question this way, I believe. How safe is it for anyone to engage with the high priestess archetype and dive into the darkness of inner dimensions? Okay. So if we accept the high priestess archetype as something that is really powerful to work with, then the inward darkness, which is symbolically linked to the darkness of underworld and Hades, becomes the darkness within us that has the power to kind of render us inarticulate, unable to kind of express what is oppressing our minds, or kind of restricting our potential. Okay, so it's a real risk that we run whenever we engage with the archetype of the high priestess and kind of try to meditate on what is in ourselves in order to become more powerful people, and in order to be able to meet the darkness outside of ourselves in the world on a more equal footing. Okay, moving on to the other slide. Okay, I'm going to continue with the quote from Dusty. This, meaning Persephone's status as Queen of the Dead, reinforces the notion that the High Priestess card is power beyond the subconscious. Along with the sea behind her, you can see that there is the sea behind the curtain. It's very deliberately screened from the viewer by the curtain. You know, I think for that kind of to serve that symbolic, the symbolic function of the high priestess. You know, she's like a kind of a figure, a state of meditative receptivity, cross in order to reach the secret, the riches hidden below the sea of the subconscious. Okay. So this reinforces the notion that the high priestess card is power beyond the subconscious, along with the sea behind her. The
Khalid, 2 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. The crescent moon of intuitive insight is at her feet, and the twin pillars of light and dark. All miscellaneous aspects aside, the importance of the high priestess is her representation of duality. Okay, so I'm going to have to skip to, I guess, the conclusion, because we don't have too much time, I believe. Okay, so two forms of duality that we have to work with is truth and falsehood. What's real with the story of the virus we're facing today? Is it natural or fabricated? Is it a pandemic, as Dr. Judy Mikovits claimed, or is it a catastrophic lab accident? And then also we have to decide where to align ourselves, our beliefs, between consensus narratives and alternative narratives. So what counts as a reliable and authoritative source of information, and what might be at stake in controlling the narrative surrounding the virus, okay? And finally, what are the pricey pearls of the high priestess? Finding and connecting to sources of intuition that are often more reliable than sources of knowledge, especially those that are widely accepted. Discovering all the ways in which you're strange to yourself, and finding the lines of connection between your strangeness and that of the world. Intuiting the psychological and spiritual themes and patterns behind collective forms of oppression, and finding peace in the withdrawal into the silent space of darkness, and rereading the scroll of life from within that space. Thank you. I'm done.
Would you like to stop your recording?
Yep, 1 second.
That was honestly, so much to take in, Khalid. Wow. I cannot believe that the work that you did on that. What I think, I mean, I haven't had this conversation with you privately. I think you should put that out as a podcast with the pages that you didn't do, or that we didn't have time for, because obviously this could have a knock-on effect for the whole of the schedule, so we had to stop you. And I think that's also a lot for people to process, and I think that'd be great on a podcast. Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think that was really, really intense and fascinating, and shows just how much depth there are in those tarot cards. That was like unbelievable. And it's like, oh my God, it's like 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. My brain is like on overload. So thank you very, very much. Right. And I think that would be really, really useful for people if you're happy to do that. And obviously that will be credited to you. That's all your own writing. So big round of applause for Khalid. And we're going to lighten it up completely now, because we're going to play some games. Woohoo! Like with Greg. So thank you, Khalid, and we'll see you again later on.
Yes,
All the
see you.
best.
Thank you.